31. Baby taught mother. Bear to read. Medical charts for better patient care. Everyone was amazed. Baby taught mother bear to read. Medical charts for better patient care. Everyone was amazed before moving into the story. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe the children's ward at St. Mary's Hospital carried a peculiar silence that night, the kind that made Dr. Ethan Marshall pause in the hallway and listen more carefully. It wasn't the absence of sound exactly, but rather a quality to the quiet that felt different somehow, as if the very air held its breath waiting for something to happen. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune overhead, casting their harsh white glow across the polished linoleum floors, but even they seemed softer tonight, more forgiving, perhaps. Ethan had been walking these same corridors for 7 years now, his footsteps creating a rhythm that had become as natural to him as his own heartbeat. Yet tonight something felt distinctly different, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., that strange hour when the hospital seemed to exist in a different dimension altogether, suspended between the chaos of day and the promise of dawn. Ethan adjusted his white coat, feeling the weight of his stethoscope around his neck, a familiar comfort that had become part of his identity over the years. His rounds were almost complete, just a few more rooms to check, a few more charts to review, but his mind kept circling back to the strange pattern he'd been noticing over the past few weeks. 3 children, all with different conditions that had stumped the entire medical team, had shown sudden and inexplicable improvements. Not dramatic recoveries, nothing that would make headlines or medical journals, but subtle shifts that defied their previous trajectories. Little Emma, with her rare metabolic disorder, had suddenly stabilized after weeks of decline. Marcus, the 8-year-old with the mysterious neurological symptoms, had regained movement in his left hand when all tests suggested permanent damage. And then there was Sophia, whose chronic respiratory issues had improved just enough to take her off the critical list. These weren't miracles in the traditional sense, Ethan told himself as he paused outside room 314, checking the chart in his hand. They were improvements, yes, but medicine was full of surprises, full of moments when the human body decided to fight back in ways that science couldn't always predict or explain. Still, the timing was curious, the pattern too consistent to ignore completely. He made a mental note to review all 3 cases again in the morning, to look for some common thread he might have missed, some medication interaction or environmental factor that could explain what was happening. The ward itself was a maze of rooms and corridors, each one holding its own story of struggle and hope. The walls were painted in what the hospital administrators called soothing pastels, though Ethan had always thought they looked more like faded memories of actual colors. Pictures drawn by former patients decorated the bulletin boards, their bright crayons and markers creating spots of genuine joy against the institutional backdrop. He passed the nurse's station where Jessica Brooks was bent over paperwork, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better hours. She looked up as he approached, offering a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Quiet night?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Jessica nodded, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Too quiet, if you ask me," she replied, her voice carrying that particular exhaustion that came from too many night shifts in a row. "You know how it gets when things are this calm. Makes you wonder what's coming." Ethan understood the feeling. In pediatric medicine, silence could be a blessing or a warning, and distinguishing between the two was an art form that took years to master. He continued his rounds, stopping at each room to observe the sleeping children through the small windows in the doors. Each child represented a puzzle, a unique combination of symptoms and responses that required constant adjustment and reevaluation. This was what had drawn him to pediatrics in the first place. This complex dance between science and intuition, between textbook knowledge and the unpredictable nature of young bodies still learning how to exist in the world. But lately, he'd been feeling the weight of it more acutely. The cases that didn't respond to treatment, the parents whose hope slowly transformed into resignation, the limitations of what modern medicine could actually accomplish despite all its advances. Room 3. 18 drew his attention next, not because of any medical emergency but because of its occupants. Through the window, he could see them clearly in the soft glow of the nightlight. Lily Morgan sat in the chair beside the window, her posture rigid and unchanging as it had been for the past 3 months since she'd arrived. Her dark hair fell around her face like a curtain, obscuring her features, but Ethan knew them well enough by now. She was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with delicate features that might have been beautiful if they held any animation, any spark of life. But Lily Morgan existed in a state that the other staff had started calling present but absent, physically there but mentally somewhere else entirely, lost in whatever trauma or condition had brought her to this state. Beside her, in the hospital-provided bassinet, lay her son Jacob. Even from the hallway, Ethan could see the baby was awake, his eyes open and seemingly focused on something in the middle distance. It was unnerving, the way that infant watched the world. Most babies his age, around 6 months now, would be sleeping at this hour, or, if awake, crying for attention or food. But Jacob was different. He rarely cried, rarely fussed, just observed with those dark eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any infant should possess. The nurses had commented on it multiple times. How the baby seemed to track conversations. How his gaze would follow medical procedures with an intensity that made even experienced staff uncomfortable. Ethan entered the room quietly, not wanting to disturb the strange tableau, though he knew from experience that neither mother nor child would react to his presence. The room smelled of the standard hospital mixture of disinfectant and something else, something harder to define. Perhaps it was the absence of the usual smells associated with an infant, the lack of baby powder or formula, the missing sense of a normal life. He checked Jacob's chart first, noting that all his vitals were normal, his development on track despite the unusual circumstances of his daily life. The baby's eyes followed him as he moved, that unsettling gaze that seemed to see through rather than at him. Lily's chart was more complex, filled with notations from various specialists who had examined her over the months. Postpartum catatonia was the official diagnosis, though several doctors had added question marks and alternative theories in the margins. She ate when food was placed in her mouth, drank when water was offered, but showed no voluntary movement, no response to stimuli, no indication that she was aware of her surroundings or even her own child. It was heartbreaking in a way that Ethan tried not to dwell on. This young mother locked inside herself while her baby grew and changed without her participation. The door opened behind him, and he turned to see Savannah Reed entering with her characteristic, purposeful stride. Even at this ungodly hour, the head nurse maintained her commanding presence, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun that had earned her comparisons to a military sergeant. But those who worked with her knew better. Beneath that stern exterior beat a heart that bled for every child in her care, hence the nickname Mother Bear that followed her through the hospital corridors. She could be fierce when protecting her young patients, had been known to stand up to doctors twice her size when she felt a child's needs weren't being met, but she could also display a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of the most hardened medical professionals. "Dr. Marshall," she acknowledged with a nod, her voice carrying its usual authority even when whispered. "I didn't expect to see you here at this hour." There was something in her tone, a slight edge that Ethan couldn't quite identify. Not suspicion exactly, but perhaps a protectiveness that extended beyond the normal nurse-patient relationship. He'd noticed that Savannah spent an unusual amount of time in this room, more than the medical needs of either patient required. During her breaks, he'd seen her sitting beside Lily, sometimes reading aloud from medical journals, sometimes just sitting in silence as if keeping vigil. "Just finishing my rounds," Ethan replied, watching as Savannah moved to check on Jacob, her movements gentle despite her imposing presence. The baby's eyes tracked her with that same intense focus, and for a moment Ethan could have sworn he saw the infant's lips curve into something resembling a smile. But that was impossible, he told himself. Babies that young didn't smile with intention. It was just gas or involuntary muscle movement. Still, the way Savannah smiled back, as if sharing a secret with the child, made him wonder. "How are they doing?" he asked, though he knew the medical answer from the charts. Savannah's expression softened as she adjusted Jacob's blanket with practiced care. "The same," she said, but then added quietly, "but different too, if that makes any sense." It didn't, not really, but Ethan found himself nodding anyway. There was something about this room, about these two patients, that defied easy categorization. They were medical mysteries, yes, but they were also something more, something that touched on the ineffable aspects of human connection that medicine couldn't quite capture in charts and diagnoses. As he prepared to leave, Ethan noticed something on the bedside table that hadn't been there during his last visit. A medical chart, not Lily's or Jacob's, but from another patient, lay open beside a pen. It was unusual, strictly against protocol actually, to have another patient's information in this room. He was about to mention it to Savannah when she quickly moved to gather up the papers, her movement just a bit too quick, too defensive. "I was just reviewing some cases," she explained, without being asked. "Sometimes I like to think through complex situations in a quiet environment." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about it rang false to Ethan's ears. He left the room with more questions than answers, the feeling that something significant was happening just beyond his understanding growing stronger. As he continued down the hallway, he couldn't shake the image of that chart on the bedside table, the way Savannah had moved to hide it, the strange sense that the very air in that room held secrets waiting to be discovered. The hospital continued its nighttime rhythm around him. The soft beeping of monitors, the distant sound of an elevator, the whispered conversations of night shift staff, but his mind kept returning to room 318 and its mysterious occupants. The next morning brought the usual chaos of shift change and morning rounds. Ethan had managed a few hours of sleep in the on-call room, but his dreams had been filled with dark eyes watching him, with charts covered in illegible writing, with Savannah Reed standing guard over secrets he couldn't quite grasp. He shook off the lingering unease as he prepared for the morning meeting, gathering his notes on the patients he needed to discuss with the team. It was during this meeting that the first real clue presented itself, though he didn't recognize it as such at the time. Dr. Michael Hayes, one of the senior physicians, was presenting the case of Timothy Chen, a 7-year-old with a complex autoimmune condition that had resisted all standard treatments. The boy had been declining steadily for weeks, his body attacking itself in ways that made treatment a delicate balance between helping and harming. Michael was outlining the latest test results when he paused, a puzzled expression crossing his weathered features. "This is odd," he said, holding up the chart for everyone to see. "There's a notation here I don't recognize. Someone has circled this particular lab value and put a question mark next to it." He showed the chart around the table, and Ethan leaned forward to get a better look. The marking was strange indeed, made with what appeared to be an unsteady hand, almost childlike in its execution. The circled value was for something most doctors might overlook, a minor elevation in a specific antibody that was usually considered clinically insignificant. Probably one of the medical students, someone suggested, but Michael shook his head. I asked. None of them have been near this chart. And look at this. He pointed to another page where a similar mark appeared, this time an arrow drawn between two seemingly unrelated symptoms. Someone is trying to tell us something, but I'll be damned if I know who or what. The room fell into a contemplative silence, each doctor examining the marks with professional curiosity. It was Ethan who finally spoke up, his voice thoughtful. What if we follow the suggestion? He proposed. I mean, that antibody level, combined with the symptom correlation the arrow indicates, it could point to a rare variant of his condition. There's a paper I read recently about atypical presentations in pediatric autoimmune cases. The discussion that followed was animated, with doctors debating the merits of pursuing this new direction. In the end, they decided to run additional tests based on the mysterious markings, if only to rule out the possibility. By afternoon, the results were back, and the room was electric with a mixture of excitement and confusion. The mysterious annotator had been right. Timothy Chen did indeed have a rare variant of his condition, one that required a completely different treatment approach. Within hours of starting the new protocol, the boy showed signs of improvement. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was progress where there had been none. Hope where there had been only decline. Ethan found himself standing outside Timothy's room, watching as the boy's parents cried with relief, their hands clasped over their son's as he managed a weak smile. It should have been a moment of pure professional satisfaction, but instead, he felt a growing unease. Who had made those marks? How had they known what the entire medical team had missed? He thought of the chart he'd seen in Lily Morgan's room, of Savannah's defensive posture, of the way baby Jacob's eyes seemed to see everything. Over the next few days, more mysterious annotations appeared, always on the charts of the most critical cases, always in that same unsteady hand, and always pointing toward solutions that the medical team had overlooked. A small notation on Madison Wright's chart led to the discovery of a drug interaction that was hampering her recovery. A circled symptom on David Park's paperwork revealed a genetic marker that changed his entire treatment plan. Each time, the markings were subtle, easy to dismiss, but when followed, they led to breakthroughs that bordered on the miraculous. The medical staff was buzzing with theories. Some thought it was a senior doctor playing games, testing the younger staff's diagnostic skills. Others wondered if they had a savant among the nursing staff, someone with an intuitive understanding of medicine that transcended formal training. But Ethan had his own theory forming, one that seemed impossible yet increasingly difficult to ignore. The markings had started appearing around the same time that Savannah had begun spending her breaks in room 318. The handwriting, while unsteady, showed a particular way of forming certain letters that seemed familiar somehow, though he couldn't quite place where he'd seen it before. He began his own investigation, discreet and careful. He reviewed the security footage from the hallways, looking for patterns of movement around the times the charts were marked. He cross-referenced the timing of the annotations with staff schedules, trying to identify who had access to the charts at the crucial moments. But the mystery only deepened. The charts were often marked during times when the hallways were empty, when the security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the rooms where they were stored. It was Jessica Brooks who inadvertently provided the next clue. She mentioned during a coffee break that she'd seen Savannah carrying medical journals into Lily Morgan's room. "It's sweet, really," Jessica said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "She reads to her, you know. Medical cases, treatment protocols, all sorts of complex stuff. She says she believes Lily can hear her, that somewhere inside her mind is still active. Ethan's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Reading medical cases to a catatonic patient. It was unusual, certainly, but Savannah had always been unconventional in her compassion. That night, Ethan made a decision that he would later question but never truly regret. He placed a small camera in the supply closet that had a view of the hallway leading to room 318. It was a violation of protocol, possibly even illegal, but he had to know what was happening. The children in his ward were getting better because of those mysterious marks, and if there was something more he could learn, some technique or insight that could help even more patients, didn't he have an obligation to uncover it? For 3 nights, nothing unusual happened. Savannah made her regular rounds, spent her breaks in room 318 as usual, but there was nothing on the footage that explained the mysterious annotations. Ethan was beginning to think he'd imagined the connection when, on the 4th night, something extraordinary occurred. He watched the footage the next morning, and what he saw changed everything he thought he knew about medicine, about consciousness, and about the power of human connection. The timestamp showed 3:15 a.m. when Savannah entered room 318 carrying a stack of charts. This in itself was unusual and against protocol, but what happened next defied all explanation. Through the partially open door, the camera captured Savannah sitting beside Lily's chair, spreading the charts across the bedside table. She began speaking, her voice too low for the camera to pick up clearly, but her posture suggested she was explaining something, discussing the cases as if Lily were a colleague rather than a patient locked in catatonia. Then, in a movement so gentle it was almost invisible, Savannah took Lily's hand and placed a pen in it. She guided the hand to the chart, and together, in movements that looked more like a dance than a medical consultation, they made marks on the papers. The camera angle didn't show the exact annotations being made, but Ethan could see the concentration on Savannah's face, the way she would pause, look at Lily's eyes, then continue guiding her hand. And throughout it all, baby Jacob watched from his bassinet, those dark eyes following every movement with an intensity that seemed impossible for an infant. Ethan sat back in his office chair, the laptop screen still showing the frozen image of that extraordinary scene. His mind raced through the implications. If Lily Morgan was somehow conscious, somehow able to communicate through these guided movements, it would be a medical sensation. Locked-in syndrome was one possibility, but the complete lack of voluntary movement argued against it. And yet, those marks on the charts were leading to real medical breakthroughs. Somehow, whether through Lily or through some unconscious collaboration between her and Savannah, diagnostic insights were emerging that were saving lives. He thought about confronting Savannah immediately, but decided to wait, to observe more. If this was real, if there was truly some form of communication happening, he needed to understand it better before potentially disrupting it. The children who were getting better, the families who were getting their kids back, they were the priority. Whatever was happening in room 318, it was working, and sometimes in medicine, that was enough. The days that followed took on a surreal quality for Ethan. He continued his rounds, attended meetings, and reviewed charts, but always with part of his attention focused on room 318 and its mysteries. He began to notice things he'd overlooked before. The way Savannah's eyes would light up when she emerged from the room, as if she'd had a breakthrough conversation with an old friend. The way baby Jacob seemed more alert during the hours after these sessions, his already intense gaze even more focused. The way Lily's hand, supposedly completely without voluntary control, would sometimes rest at slightly different angles, as if it had moved when no one was watching. More charts were marked, more breakthroughs achieved. A child with a mysterious fever that had resisted all antibiotics was found to have a rare fungal infection after a notation pointed doctors toward an unusual test. A baby with failure to thrive was discovered to have a genetic condition so rare that only a handful of cases had ever been documented, but the chart marking led them right to it. Each success built on the last, creating a wave of positive outcomes that had the entire pediatric ward buzzing with optimism. But it was also creating tension. Other doctors were beginning to ask harder questions about the mysterious annotations. Some were angry, feeling that someone was showing them up, making them look incompetent. Others were desperate to know the secret, to learn from whoever was providing these insights. The hospital administration was starting to take notice too, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before an official investigation was launched. He decided he needed more evidence before that happened. If he was going to protect whatever was happening in room 318, he needed to understand it fully. So he upgraded his surveillance, placing a better camera that could capture more detail. He felt guilty about it, knew he was crossing ethical lines, but he justified it by thinking of all the children who might benefit from understanding this phenomenon. The night he captured the full truth was one he would never forget. It was a Tuesday, the ward quieter than usual, with several children having been discharged after successful treatments. Savannah entered room 318 at her usual time, but this night she brought something different. A particularly complex case that had stumped the entire medical team. 8-year-old Connor Adams had been in the hospital for 2 weeks with symptoms that didn't match any known condition. His body was shutting down system by system, but every test came back inconclusive. Through the high-definition camera, Ethan could see everything clearly. Savannah sat beside Lily and began explaining Connor's case in detail, reading from his chart, describing his symptoms with the thoroughness of a medical presentation. As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. Lily's eyes, usually unfocused and distant, began to move. Not randomly, but with purpose, tracking across invisible text as if she were reading something only she could see. Savannah noticed it too, leaning forward excitedly. "You see something, don't you?" she said, her voice just loud enough for the camera to pick up. "Show me, Lily. Show me what you see." She placed the pen in Lily's hand and guided it to the chart. But this time, Ethan could see that it wasn't just Savannah guiding. There was resistance in Lily's hand, tiny movements that seemed to be fighting against the paralysis, trying to direct the pen to specific spots on the page. Together, they circled a symptom that seemed insignificant, drew an arrow to connect it to another, and placed a question mark next to a normal-looking test result. The effort seemed to exhaust Lily, her eyes closing as if she'd run a marathon, but Savannah was elated. She kissed Lily's forehead gently, whispered, "Thank you, my friend," and then turned to Jacob's bassinet. The baby was awake, watching, and Savannah picked him up, holding him so he could see his mother's face. "Your mama just saved another life," she told him softly. "She's still in there, fighting to help others, even when she can't help herself." The next morning, when Connor's medical team followed the mysterious annotations, they discovered he had an extremely rare metabolic disorder that only manifested under specific conditions. The treatment was simple once they knew what they were dealing with, and within days, Connor was showing remarkable improvement. His parents called it a miracle, but Ethan knew better. It wasn't divine intervention, it was something perhaps even more remarkable, a human mind refusing to be silenced, finding a way to communicate through the tiniest of movements, guided by the unwavering faith of a friend. But knowing the truth created a new dilemma for Ethan. How could he reveal this without potentially destroying it? If the hospital administration found out that Savannah was violating protocol, she could lose her job. If they subjected Lily to extensive testing to understand her condition, it might disrupt whatever delicate balance allowed these communications to happen. And there was still so much he didn't understand. How did Lily know these things? How could someone in her condition process such complex medical information and provide insights that trained doctors missed? He decided to dig deeper into Lily Morgan's background, using his medical connections to piece together her history. What he found stunned him. Before her current condition, Lily hadn't been just anyone. Dr. Lily Morgan had been a rising star in the field of diagnostic medicine, with a particular gift for seeing patterns others missed. She'd published papers on intuitive diagnosis, on the importance of looking at the whole patient rather than just symptoms. She'd been working on revolutionary approaches to pediatric diagnosis when she became pregnant. The pregnancy had been difficult, with complications that required constant medical supervision. Lily had continued working through it all, even conducting research from her hospital bed during the final weeks. Then came the delivery, and something went catastrophically wrong. A rare complication during childbirth had deprived her brain of oxygen for several critical minutes. The baby survived unharmed, but Lily was left in her current state, diagnosed as catatonic, written off by most of the medical establishment as lost. But Savannah Reed had known her before. They had worked together years ago at another hospital, had been close friends who shared a passion for pediatric medicine. When Savannah heard about what happened to Lily, she had arranged for her to be transferred to St. Mary's had taken it upon herself to care for both mother and child. The staff had thought it was just Savannah's characteristic compassion, but now Ethan understood it was so much more. It was loyalty, friendship, and an unshakable belief that her brilliant friend was still present, still fighting to contribute despite her body's betrayal. The weight of this knowledge sat heavily on Ethan's shoulders as he went about his duties. Every time he passed room 318, he felt the pull of the secret it contained. He watched Savannah with new respect, seeing not just a dedicated nurse but a friend whose faith had literally been saving lives. He observed baby Jacob with wonder, thinking about what it must be like to grow up in the presence of such profound love and sacrifice. The pattern continued for weeks. More annotations, more breakthroughs, more children saved or improved by the insights that emerged from that quiet room. The medical staff had stopped questioning the mysterious marks, had begun to simply accept them as part of the diagnostic process. Some called it the guardian angel phenomenon, others referred to it as the miracle notes, but all agreed that whoever was behind them had a gift that transcended normal medical training. It was during a particularly difficult case that everything began to change. Avery Johnson, a 4-year-old with multiple organ failure of unknown origin, had been brought in as a last resort. Every specialist had examined her, every test had been run, but nothing provided answers. The child was dying, and no one knew why. The desperation in her parents' eyes haunted the entire ward, a reminder of medicine's limitations despite all its advances. Ethan found himself standing outside room 318 one evening, wrestling with a decision. Should he directly ask Savannah for help with Avery's case? Should he reveal that he knew the truth? As he stood there, the door opened, and Savannah emerged, looking tired but determined. She saw him and paused, something in his expression making her eyes narrow slightly. "Dr. Marshall," she said carefully, "is everything all right?" He looked at her, this formidable woman who had been secretly channeling the brilliant mind of her friend to save lives, and made his choice. "Avery Johnson," he said simply. "We're losing her, and we don't know why. I thought perhaps you might have some insights." The words hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Savannah studied his face for a long moment, and he saw the exact moment she understood that he knew. "I review all the difficult cases," she said finally, her voice steady but her eyes wary. "Sometimes a fresh perspective helps." It was a lifeline, a way to maintain the fiction if he chose to take it. But Ethan shook his head slightly. "Sometimes the best perspectives come from unexpected places," he replied. "From people who see patterns others miss, even when they can't speak them aloud." Savannah's composure cracked slightly, tears gathering in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "She was brilliant, is brilliant. Her mind, it's all still there, trapped. She sees things, understands things. I just help her show us." Ethan nodded, his own eyes moist. "Then help her show us how to save Avery," he said. "Please." That night, Ethan watched from the doorway as Savannah brought Avery's complete medical file to room 318. She spread everything out, reading each detail aloud, her voice passionate and urgent. Lily's eyes moved frantically, and when Savannah placed the pen in her hand, the marks came faster than ever before. Circles, arrows, underlines, question marks, a complex web of connections that seemed random at first, but slowly revealed a pattern. It took the medical team 2 days to fully understand what Lily had shown them. Avery had a combination of 3 separate, rare conditions, each masking the others, creating a perfect storm of symptoms that appeared to be one impossible disease. Once they understood this, treatment became possible, though still complex. It would take months of careful management, but Avery would live. Her parents sobbed with relief when they heard the news, and Ethan found himself crying too, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. The success with Avery changed things. Ethan couldn't keep the secret alone anymore, but he also couldn't betray Savannah and Lily. He arranged a private meeting with the Chief of Staff, Dr. Patricia Williams, a woman known for her compassion as much as her medical acumen. He presented it carefully, focusing on the medical implications rather than the violations of protocol. A former diagnostic genius, trapped in a catatonic state but still able to communicate through minimal guided movement. A nurse who had found a way to channel this brilliance to save lives. Results that spoke for themselves. Dr. Williams listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly just absorbing the extraordinary tale. When Ethan finished, she sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You're telling me that some of our most impressive diagnostic breakthroughs have come from a supposedly catatonic patient?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "With the help of Nurse Reed, yes. The evidence is undeniable." What followed was a series of careful, quiet meetings. Neurologists were brought in to examine Lily, but discreetly, without the fanfare that might disrupt the delicate process. They confirmed what Savannah had believed all along. Lily's mind was largely intact, trapped in a body that had lost most voluntary control. The minimal movements she could manage, guided by Savannah's touch, were her only means of communication, but through them, she was still practicing medicine at the highest level. The hospital's response was remarkable. Instead of censure or scandal, there was adaptation. A special protocol was established, officially recognizing Lily as a consulting diagnostician. Savannah was given a new role as her medical liaison, their unconventional partnership formalized and protected. Technology specialists were brought in to explore better communication methods, though nothing proved as effective as the simple pen and paper guided by Savannah's patient hand. The story could have ended there, a medical curiosity, a heartwarming tale of friendship and determination. But there was one more twist that changed everything. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the hospital had officially recognized Lily's contribution. Ethan was in room 318, discussing a case with Savannah and, through her, with Lily. Baby Jacob, now 8 months old, was in his bassinet, those watchful eyes following the conversation as always. They were reviewing a particularly complex case when something extraordinary occurred. As Savannah guided Lily's hand to make a notation, Jacob made a sound. Not a cry or a babble, but a deliberate vocalization that made all 3 adults freeze. The baby reached out his tiny hand toward the chart, his movement purposeful and directed. Savannah, always attuned to the smallest communications, moved the chart closer to the bassinet. What happened next defied all understanding of infant development. Jacob's hand touched a specific spot on the chart, then moved to another, creating a connection that hadn't been made before. It was impossible. An 8-month-old couldn't understand medical charts, couldn't make diagnostic connections. But as they followed the path his tiny finger had traced, they found another layer to the diagnosis, one that even Lily had missed. The truth, when it finally emerged through careful observation and testing, was even more remarkable than anyone could have imagined. Jacob had been present for every session, had watched his mother's eyes track across invisible patterns, had absorbed the medical discussions in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Somehow, whether through genetics, environment, or something beyond current understanding, he was developing an intuitive grasp of pattern recognition that mirrored his mother's gift. The title that the media would eventually give to the story, Baby Taught Mother Bear to Read Medical Charts, was a misunderstanding of what really happened. It wasn't Jacob who taught anyone anything, at least not directly. It was the combination of all of them. Lily's brilliant mind refusing to be silenced, Savannah's unwavering faith and friendship, Jacob's mysterious to bridge the gap between them, and Ethan's courage to see beyond the conventional. Together they had created something unprecedented in medical history. The confrontation that would change everything came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, the kind of day when the hospital seemed to exist in its own bubble, separated from the outside world by sheets of water streaming down the windows. Dr. Ethan Marshall had spent the night reviewing the footage again, trying to reconcile what he knew with what he had to do, and by morning he had made his decision. He found Savannah Reed in the supply room, organizing medications with her characteristic precision, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had performed this task thousands of times before. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, something in his expression made her hands still, a bottle of antibiotics suspended in midair as if time itself had paused. "We need to talk," Ethan said quietly, closing the door behind him. The supply room suddenly felt smaller, the shelves of medicines and equipment pressing in like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Savannah set down the bottle carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled, but Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed her uniform. "About what, Doctor?" "Marshall?" she asked, though they both knew the pretense was pointless now. The truth hung between them like a living thing, demanding to be acknowledged. Ethan pulled out his phone and showed her a still image from the footage, Savannah guiding Lily's hand across a medical chart while baby Jacob watched from his bassinet. The color drained from Savannah's face, and for the first time since he'd known her, the formidable Mother Bear looked vulnerable, almost fragile. Her legs seemed to give way, and she sank onto a small stool, her hands covering her face as her shoulders began to shake. The tears came then, not the gentle weeping of sadness, but the violent sobs of someone releasing months, perhaps years, of carried burden. "You don't understand," she managed between sobs, her voice muffled by her hands. "You can't possibly understand what it's been like." Ethan moved closer, pulling up another stool to sit beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to intrude on her grief. "Then, help me understand." he said gently. "Tell me everything." Savannah lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, mascara creating dark rivers down her cheeks. She looked older suddenly, the weight of her secret etched in every line of her face. "Lily Morgan," she began, her voice rough with emotion. "Doctor, Lily Morgan was the most brilliant diagnostician I've ever known. We met 15 years ago when we were both working at Children's Hospital in Boston. She was young, just out of her residency, but she had this gift, this ability to see patterns that everyone else missed. She could look at a child and somehow know things that all our tests couldn't reveal." She paused, pulling a tissue from her pocket to wipe her eyes, though fresh tears immediately replaced those she'd cleared away. "We became friends, real friends, not just colleagues. She was my maid of honor when I got married, was there when my husband died of cancer 5 years later. She held me while I cried, stayed with me through the darkest period of my life. When she got pregnant, I was so happy for her. She'd wanted a child for so long, had gone through 3 miscarriages before Jacob. This pregnancy was different, though, difficult from the start. She had hyperemesis gravidarum, couldn't keep anything down for months. Then gestational diabetes, then preeclampsia. But she never complained, never stopped working. Even from her hospital bed, she was reviewing cases, making diagnoses that saved lives. Ethan listened without interrupting, understanding that this story had been bottled up inside Savannah for too long, needed to be told in its entirety. Savannah continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. The delivery was supposed to be routine, a scheduled C-section because of all the complications. But something went wrong. An amniotic fluid embolism, 1 in 50,000 chance. Her heart stopped for 7 minutes. 7 minutes, Dr. Marshall. They got her back, saved the baby, but the damage was done. The brilliant mind that had saved so many was locked away, trapped in a body that wouldn't respond. She stood up then, pacing the small space between the shelves, her hands gesturing as she spoke. The other doctors gave up on her. Persistent vegetative state, they said. No meaningful recovery possible, they said. They wanted to move her to a long-term care facility, basically a warehouse for the living dead. I couldn't let that happen. I pulled every string I had, called in every favor, got her transferred here where I could take care of her. Everyone thought I was just being sentimental, unable to let go of my friend. But I knew better. I could see it in her eyes sometimes, flashes of the Lily I knew, moments of recognition that the tests couldn't measure. She turned to face Ethan, her expression fierce despite the tears. I started talking to her, really talking, not just the patronizing nonsense people say to comatose patients. I talked to her like she was still there, still my brilliant friend. I read medical journals to her, discussed cases, asked her opinion even though she couldn't answer. And then one day, about 3 months ago, something changed. I was telling her about a difficult case, a child with symptoms that didn't make sense, and I saw her eyes moving, not randomly, but with purpose, like she was reading something invisible. On a whim, I put a pen in her hand, guided it to paper, and felt the tiniest resistance, the smallest attempt at movement. Savannah's voice dropped to almost a whisper, as if she was sharing a sacred secret. It took weeks to develop our system. I would guide her hand, but she would provide these tiny moments of resistance or cooperation that told me where she wanted to mark. It was exhausting for her, you could see it, each session leaving her drained. But she kept fighting, kept trying. And the marks she made, they were brilliant. She was still diagnosing, still seeing patterns, still saving lives, just through the tiniest movements that only I could feel. Ethan found himself crying too, overwhelmed by the profound love and determination in Savannah's story. "But how?" he asked. "How can she still process such complex medical information in her condition?" Savannah shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips despite the tears. "I don't know. Maybe her brain rewired itself somehow, found new pathways. Maybe the part of her that understands medicine is so fundamental to who she is that even massive trauma couldn't destroy it. Or maybe it's just love, Doctor, Marshall. Love for the children she's helping. Love for her son, watching her. Love for medicine itself. Sometimes love is stronger than anything science can measure." She sat back down, suddenly looking exhausted. "I know I've violated every protocol, broken rules that could end my career. But those children, the ones Lily has helped save, aren't they worth it? If you have to report me, I understand. Just please, let me say goodbye to her first. Let me explain why I won't be able to come anymore." The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. The thought of abandoning her friend clearly more devastating than any professional consequences. Ethan reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses from years of medical work, the strength that had supported so many. "I'm not going to report you," he said firmly. "I'm going to help you. What you and Lily have accomplished, it's extraordinary. We need to find a way to make it official, to protect both of you, while allowing this gift to continue." The relief on Savannah's face was transformative, years seeming to fall away, as hope replaced despair. "There's more," Savannah said, her voice barely audible. "About Jacob. He's not normal. I don't mean there's anything wrong with him, quite the opposite. He watches everything with this intensity that no baby should have. Sometimes when I'm working with Lily, guiding her hand, I swear he's directing us somehow. His eyes will focus on specific parts of the chart, and when I follow his gaze, it leads to insights even Lily missed. It's impossible, I know. He's just a baby. But Dr. Marshall, I think he inherited more than just his mother's eyes. I think he inherited her gift, maybe even amplified it somehow." Ethan thought about all the times he'd seen Jacob watching, those dark eyes that seemed to hold impossible understanding. "We need to document this properly," he said, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Not as some violation of protocol, but as a medical phenomenon that needs to be studied and understood. Lily is still practicing medicine, just through an unconventional method. And if Jacob is showing signs of extraordinary pattern recognition, that needs to be documented too." Over the next hours, hidden away in that supply room, they developed a plan. Ethan would approach the chief of staff with a carefully crafted proposal, presenting Lily's contribution as a form of assisted communication that deserved recognition and study. They would bring in specialists, not to experiment on Lily, but to better understand her condition and potentially improve the communication method. And they would monitor Jacob's development carefully, documenting any signs of unusual cognitive abilities without subjecting him to invasive testing. "But first," Ethan said, standing up and offering Savannah his hand, "I want to meet her properly. Not as a patient, but as the colleague she still is." Savannah's smile was radiant through her remaining tears as she took his hand and led him to room 318. The room was quiet when they entered, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Lily sat in her usual chair by the window, her dark hair catching the light in a way that made it glow like polished mahogany. Up close, Ethan could see what he'd missed in all his previous observations. Despite the stillness of her features, there was an alertness in her eyes, a presence that suggested active thought rather than vacant existence. Jacob was awake in his bassinet, those remarkable eyes tracking their entrance with an attention that still sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "Lily," Savannah said softly, moving to her friend's side and taking her hand gently. "This is Dr. Ethan Marshall. He knows about our work. He knows what you've been doing, and he wants to help." Ethan watched in fascination as Lily's eyes shifted, focusing on him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being examined and diagnosed himself. There was intelligence there, fierce and undimmed despite her physical limitations. "Dr. Morgan," Ethan said, deliberately using her professional title. "It's an honor to meet you. Your work, what you've accomplished under these circumstances, it's nothing short of miraculous. The children you've helped, the lives you've saved, they may never know your name, but I want you to know that I see you. I see what you're doing, and I'm in awe." He thought he saw something change in her expression, the tiniest softening around her eyes that might have been gratitude or relief. Savannah had brought one of the current cases with her, a file she'd been planning to review with Lily later. "Should we show him?" she asked Lily, though she couldn't answer verbally. But something in her eyes must have communicated agreement, because Savannah began spreading out the papers, explaining the case of a 6-year-old with recurring seizures that didn't respond to any standard treatments. What followed was one of the most extraordinary medical consultations Ethan had ever witnessed. Savannah read the case details aloud, her voice taking on the rhythm of a medical presentation. Lily's eyes moved across the papers with purpose, occasionally pausing on specific details. When Savannah placed the pen in her hand and guided it to the paper, Ethan could actually see the tiny movements, the almost imperceptible resistance and direction that Savannah had learned to interpret. A circle here, highlighting an overlooked lab value. An arrow there, connecting two symptoms that seemed unrelated. A question mark next to a medication dosage that might need adjustment. Each mark was laboriously made, clearly exhausting for Lily, but she persisted with a determination that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. And throughout it all, baby Jacob watched, his eyes following the pen's movement with an attention that seemed to predict where the next mark would appear. When they finished, Lily's eyes closed, the effort having drained her completely. Savannah gently stroked her friend's hair, whispering words of thanks and encouragement. "She'll sleep now," she told Ethan. "These sessions take everything she has, but she'll wake up tomorrow ready to do it again because this is who she is. This is what she lives for." Ethan looked at the marked chart, already seeing the diagnostic path Lily had illuminated. The child with seizures likely had a rare metabolic disorder that was being triggered by something in their diet, something that standard tests wouldn't catch but that the pattern of symptoms suggested. It would need confirmation, but he was willing to bet Lily was right. She always was. The meeting with Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of staff, took place 2 days later in her office overlooking the hospital's main entrance. Ethan had prepared carefully, bringing not just evidence of Lily's contributions but also a proposal for how to formalize and protect this unusual arrangement. Dr. Williams listened with increasing amazement as Ethan laid out the story, showed the evidence, and explained the lives that had been saved. "You're telling me, Doctor," Williams said slowly, "that one of our most effective diagnosticians is a woman in a catatonic state who communicates through micro-movements interpreted by a nurse." When put that baldly, it sounded absurd, but Ethan nodded firmly. The results speak for themselves. 15 children have received correct diagnoses because of her input. 3 of them would likely have died without her intervention. Whatever the mechanism, it works. Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on her desk as she processed this information. "This is unprecedented," she finally said. "If word gets out, we'll have media, medical tourists, researchers all wanting access. It could turn into a circus that would ultimately harm everyone involved, especially Dr. Morgan and her son. Ethan had anticipated this concern, which is why I propose we handle this internally, at least initially. Recognize Dr. Morgan as a consulting diagnostician, formalize Nurse Reed's role as her medical interpreter, and document everything carefully for eventual publication in medical journals, but on our timeline in a way that protects everyone involved. What followed was a series of careful negotiations and planning sessions. The hospital's legal team was brought in to ensure everything was above board. Neurologists were consulted to better understand Lily's condition and confirm that she was indeed capable of the complex cognitive processing her diagnoses suggested. Technology specialists explored ways to potentially improve the communication system, though nothing proved as effective as Savannah's intuitive interpretation of Lily's micro-movements. The neurological examinations were particularly revealing. Using advanced brain imaging techniques, they discovered that Lily's brain showed unusual patterns of activity. While the motor cortex was largely silent, the areas associated with pattern recognition, medical knowledge, and complex reasoning were remarkably active, sometimes even more so than in a typical functioning brain. It was as if her mind, deprived of the need to manage bodily functions, had redirected all its energy toward pure thought. One neurologist, Dr. James Patterson, described it as the most extreme example of neuroplasticity I've ever seen. He theorized that Lily's brain had essentially rewired itself, creating new pathways to maintain her diagnostic abilities, despite the massive trauma it had suffered. It's as if her identity as a diagnostician is so fundamental that her brain prioritized preserving that function above all else, he explained to the assembled team. But it was the observations of Jacob that proved most intriguing and challenging to understand. Multiple specialists observed the infant, noting his unusual attention patterns, his apparent ability to focus on complex visual information, far beyond what should be possible for his age. One developmental psychologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, conducted non-invasive assessments and found that Jacob's visual processing and pattern recognition abilities were literally off the charts for his age. "I've never seen anything like it, Doctor," Chen admitted. "He's showing cognitive abilities that we wouldn't expect to see until age 3 or 4. Specifically in areas related to pattern recognition and visual analysis. It's as if he's inherited not just his mother's genetic predisposition for these skills, but also somehow absorbed or learned them through observation at an incredibly accelerated rate." The question of how to handle Jacob's development became a significant ethical consideration. There was enormous scientific value in studying him, but everyone involved was acutely aware of the need to protect him from becoming a medical curiosity. In the end, they decided on minimal, non-invasive monitoring, documenting his development without subjecting him to extensive testing. His welfare, they all agreed, had to come first. As word of the arrangement spread through the hospital, carefully and deliberately, the response was remarkable. Rather than skepticism or ridicule, there was an outpouring of support. Nurses volunteered to help care for Jacob when Savannah was working with Lily. Doctors began bringing their most challenging cases to room 318, which was eventually converted into a proper consultation space with better equipment and comfortable seating. The room transformation was Savannah's project, completed with donations from grateful families whose children had been helped by Lily's diagnoses. The harsh hospital lighting was replaced with softer, adjustable lamps. The uncomfortable visitor's chair was exchanged for an ergonomic seat that properly supported Lily during long consultation sessions. A special desk was installed that could be adjusted to the perfect height for their collaborative work. And for Jacob, a proper play area was created where he could safely explore, while still maintaining his watchful presence during sessions. One of the most moving moments came when the parents of Timothy Chen, the boy whose rare autoimmune condition had been identified through Lily's markings, visited room 318. They had insisted on meeting the person who had saved their son's life. Timothy's mother, tears streaming down her face, knelt beside Lily's chair and took her free hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing what everyone else missed. Thank you for saving my baby." Lily's eyes filled with tears that she couldn't wipe away, but the emotion in them was unmistakable. As the weeks turned into months, a routine developed. Savannah would spend several hours each day working with Lily, reviewing cases and translating her insights into actionable medical guidance. Ethan often joined them, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated Lily's thoughts and intentions. Other doctors began participating too, creating an informal team dedicated to channeling Lily's diagnostic gift. The success rate was remarkable. Of the 57 cases brought to Lily over a 3-month period, she provided crucial insights in 43 of them. Her ability to see patterns, to connect seemingly unrelated symptoms, to identify rare conditions that others missed, remained as sharp as ever. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger, as if the forced focus of her condition had honed her abilities to an even finer edge. But it was Jacob's development that continued to provide the most intriguing subplot to this medical drama. As he grew older, his unusual abilities became more pronounced. At 10 months, he was observed arranging his toys in complex patterns that seemed random at first, but revealed sophisticated organizational principles when analyzed. At 11 months, during one of Lily's consultation sessions, he crawled over to the desk and placed his hand on a specific part of a chart, a gesture that led to the identification of a crucial symptom that had been overlooked. "It's not possible, Doctor," Chen said, after witnessing this. "An 11-month-old doesn't have the cognitive development to understand medical charts. But, possible or not, it was happening. Theories abounded. Some suggested that constant exposure to medical discussions had created unusual neural pathways in Jacob's developing brain. Others wondered if there was some form of communication between mother and child that science couldn't yet detect. The most radical theory, proposed by a quantum physicist who had heard about the case, suggested that consciousness itself might work in ways that current science didn't understand. Ethan found himself spending more and more time in room 318, drawn not just by the medical mysteries but by the profound human story unfolding there. He watched Savannah's devotion to her friend, saw the love that powered their unconventional communication. He observed Lily's fierce determination to continue contributing despite her physical limitations. And he marveled at Jacob, this remarkable child who seemed to bridge worlds in ways that defied explanation. One evening, as the sun set over the city and painted room 318 in shades of gold and amber, Ethan sat with the unusual trio and reflected on how much had changed. What had started as a medical mystery had become something far more profound, a testament to the power of human connection, the resilience of the mind, and the mysteries that still existed in medicine despite all of humanity's advances. "You know," Savannah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "the media got it wrong when they called this story Baby Taught Mother Bear to Read Medical Charts. It wasn't Jacob teaching anyone, and I'm not the one reading the charts. It's Lily who's teaching all of us, showing us that brilliance can't be silenced, that love can bridge impossible gaps, that sometimes the most profound communications happen without words." She was right, of course. The real story was far more complex and beautiful than any headline could capture. It was about a brilliant mind refusing to be imprisoned, a friendship that transcended physical limitations, a baby whose very existence seemed to catalyze miracles, and a medical community learning that sometimes the most advanced diagnostic tool is the human spirit itself. As the months progressed, the impact of Lily's contributions grew beyond the walls of St. Mary's Hospital. Word spread through medical networks, carefully and professionally, about the unusual diagnostic resource available there. Hospitals from around the country began sending their most puzzling cases for review. Each package would arrive with complete medical histories, test results, and imaging studies. Savannah would spread them out in room 318, reading every detail aloud while Lily's eyes tracked across the information, and Jacob played quietly nearby, his attention never fully leaving the medical discussions happening around him. The process had been refined over time. Savannah had developed an almost telepathic understanding of Lily's micro-movements, able to interpret not just where she wanted to mark, but sometimes even why. They had developed a shorthand of sorts, certain patterns of marks that indicated specific types of conditions or diagnostic directions. A spiral might indicate a genetic component. A series of dots could suggest a progressive condition. Double underlines meant urgent, requiring immediate attention. One particularly memorable case involved a teenage girl from Seattle who had been experiencing progressive paralysis that didn't match any known condition. Dozens of specialists had examined her, put her through every test imaginable, but no one could determine what was causing her deterioration. The case file was thick, filled with normal test results that only deepened the mystery. When Savannah presented it to Lily, she saw something change in her friend's expression, an intensity that went beyond her usual concentration. The marking session that followed was one of the longest they'd ever had. Lily directed Savannah's hand to make connections across multiple pages, creating a web of relationships between symptoms that seemed to span different body systems. At one point, Jacob, now 13 months old and taking his first unsteady steps, toddled over to the desk and placed his small hand on a particular lab result, looking directly at his mother as if confirming something. The final pattern that emerged suggested something extraordinary. The girl didn't have a disease at all, but rather a severe nutritional deficiency caused by a genetic mutation that prevented her from absorbing a specific vitamin, despite normal dietary intake. The diagnosis seemed almost too simple, but when the Seattle team tested for it, they found Lily was exactly right. Treatment was straightforward once they knew what they were dealing with, and within weeks, the girl was showing significant improvement. Her parents sent a video message to room 318, showing their daughter taking her first unassisted steps in months. "You gave us our daughter back," the mother said through tears. "We don't understand how you did it, but you gave us our daughter back." These successes led to a formal proposal from the hospital board, one that would change everything. They wanted to establish the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center, a dedicated facility within the hospital that would formalize and expand the work being done in room 318. It would have state-of-the-art equipment, a full support staff, and resources to potentially help hundreds of children with rare or undiagnosed conditions. The proposal was presented to Lily through Savannah, who read every detail aloud, watching her friend's eyes for any sign of response. When she finished, she asked, "What do you think, Lily? Should we do this?" The answer came in the form of tears rolling down Lily's cheeks, and the slightest, almost imperceptible nod that Savannah felt more than saw. It was yes, a yes to continuing the work, a yes to helping more children, a yes to proving that even the most devastating circumstances couldn't stop a determined spirit. The development of the center took several months, during which the work in room 318 continued unabated. But changes were happening beyond the medical realm. Jacob, now approaching 18 months, was showing developmental leaps that continued to astound observers. He had begun speaking earlier than typical, But it wasn't just the timing that was remarkable. It was what he said. His first word wasn't mama or dada, but pattern, spoken clearly while pointing at one of his mother's diagnostic charts. Dr. Chen, who had been documenting Jacob's development, was running out of precedents to compare him to. His cognitive development is asymmetric, she explained to Ethan and Savannah. His language skills are advanced, but not extraordinarily so. His motor skills are actually slightly behind typical development, but his pattern recognition and analytical abilities are literally unprecedented. He's demonstrating cognitive functions we don't usually see until much later in childhood, and even then, not at this level. The question of Jacob's future became a frequent topic of discussion among the team. Would he follow in his mother's footsteps and become a diagnostician? Was his gift a blessing or a burden? How could they ensure he had a normal childhood while also nurturing his extraordinary abilities? These questions had no easy answers, but everyone agreed that Jacob's well-being had to be the priority. It was Savannah who proposed the solution that would guide Jacob's upbringing. "We raise him with love first, everything else second," she said firmly. "Yes, he has a gift, but he's also a little boy who needs to play, to laugh, to make friends. The gift will develop on its own, we've already seen that. Our job is to make sure he develops as a person, not just as a prodigy." This philosophy guided the approach to Jacob's care. While he continued to be present during many of Lily's consultation sessions, seemingly absorbing medical knowledge through osmosis, he was also enrolled in a regular daycare program where he could interact with other children. The staff was informed of his advanced cognitive abilities, but asked to treat him as normally as possible. The result was a child who could identify complex medical patterns, but also delighted in finger painting and playing with blocks. The opening of the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center was scheduled for a Tuesday in September, exactly 1 year after Ethan had discovered the truth about the mysterious annotations. The ceremony was deliberately small, limited to staff, the families who had been helped, and a select group of medical professionals who understood and respected what had been accomplished. The media had been excluded, a decision made to protect Lily and Jacob from becoming spectacles. The center itself was beautiful, designed with input from Savannah to create an environment that would be comfortable for Lily while also being functionally excellent for medical consultation. The main consultation room had large windows that let in natural light, adjustable lighting for detailed chart review, and comfortable seating for extended sessions. Adjacent rooms housed advanced diagnostic equipment that could be used to verify Lily's insights, and a special play area for Jacob that allowed him to be present while having space to be a child. But the most touching feature was a wall dedicated to the children who had been helped. Not their names or photos to protect their privacy, but a series of butterflies, each one representing a child whose life had been saved or improved through Lily's diagnoses. The wall started with 15 butterflies and had space for hundreds more, a testament to both what had been accomplished and what was yet to come. The opening ceremony was emotional for everyone involved. Dr. Williams spoke about the power of thinking beyond conventional boundaries. Several parents shared their stories, their gratitude evident in every word. But the most powerful moment came when Savannah wheeled Lily to the front of the room. She had prepared a speech, but when the moment came, she set aside her notes and spoke from the heart. "A year ago, this was just a desperate attempt to keep my friend's mind alive," she began, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "I refused to believe that brilliance could be extinguished so easily. What we discovered was that it couldn't be. Lily's mind, her gift, her determination to help children, survived something that should have destroyed it. She found a way to communicate through the tiniest movements, to diagnose through almost imperceptible resistance, to save lives despite being unable to save herself. She paused, looking down at Lily, whose eyes were focused intently on the gathered crowd. But this isn't just about medical mysteries or diagnostic brilliance. It's about love. My love for my friend. Lily's love for the children she helps. The love that drives us to push beyond what seems possible. And yes, the love of a remarkable little boy who seems to understand that his mother is doing something important, even if he can't fully grasp what that is yet. As if on cue, Jacob toddled over to his mother's wheelchair, reaching up to touch her hand. The gesture was simple, a child seeking contact with his parent, but in that moment, it represented so much more. It was a bridge between the possible and impossible, between limitation and transcendence, between silence and communication. Ethan watched this scene and thought about how much his understanding of medicine had changed over the past year. He had been taught that medicine was about tests and procedures, medications and surgeries, the tangible interventions that could be measured and quantified. But Lily had taught him that sometimes the most powerful medical tool was the human mind's ability to see patterns, to make connections that logic alone couldn't reach. And Savannah had taught him that love and loyalty could accomplish what science said was impossible. The center officially opened the next day, with its first case already waiting for review. It was a 9-year-old boy from Texas with a constellation of symptoms that had baffled every specialist who had examined him. As Savannah spread out the charts and began reading them to Lily, as Jacob played quietly with his toys while watching with those remarkable eyes, as Ethan observed and learned, it felt like more than just another medical consultation. It felt like proof that human potential couldn't be measured by conventional metrics, that consciousness and communication could transcend physical limitations, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries weren't in understanding how something worked, but in accepting that it did. Over the following months, the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center became legendary in pediatric medicine circles. Not famous in the conventional sense, they had been careful to avoid media attention that might turn Lily and Jacob into curiosities, but known among doctors dealing with the most challenging cases. The center received an average of 3 cases per week, carefully screened to focus on those where traditional diagnostic methods had failed. The success rate remained remarkably high. Of the first 100 cases reviewed, Lily provided crucial diagnostic insights in 78 of them. 23 of these children had conditions so rare that fewer than 100 cases had ever been documented worldwide. 15 had combinations of conditions that masked each other, creating diagnostic puzzles that had seemed unsolvable. And in 12 cases, Lily identified not diseases, but environmental factors, genetic sensitivities to common substances, or medication interactions that mimicked serious conditions. Each success added another butterfly to the wall, creating a growing rainbow of hope and healing. But more than that, each case added to the growing body of knowledge about how Lily's diagnostic process worked. Researchers studying the patterns of her markings began to identify consistent methodologies, ways of approaching complex medical puzzles that could be taught to other diagnosticians. Lily wasn't just solving individual cases, she was revolutionizing diagnostic thinking itself. Jacob's development continued to be a source of wonder and some concern. At 2 years old, he could identify patterns in his toys that corresponded to mathematical sequences that shouldn't be comprehensible to a toddler. He would arrange his blocks in formations that, when analyzed, showed understanding of spatial relationships typically not grasped until age 7 or 8, and his presence during diagnostic sessions seemed to enhance his mother's abilities, as if their minds were somehow connected in ways that transcended normal parent-child bonds. Dr. Chen, who had become fascinated by Jacob's case, proposed a theory that was radical, even by the standards of what they had already accepted. What if, she suggested during one team meeting, consciousness isn't as individual as we think? What if the intense bond between mother and child, combined with Lily's unique neurological state and Jacob's developmental plasticity, has created some form of shared cognitive processing? It sounds like science fiction, but so does everything else about this case. The theory was impossible to prove with current technology, but it did seem to explain some of the more mysterious aspects of what they were observing. The way Jacob would sometimes react to medical information before Savannah had finished reading it aloud, as if he were receiving it through some other channel. The way Lily's diagnostic accuracy seemed to improve when Jacob was present. The uncanny synchronization of their attention patterns during particularly complex cases. But perhaps the most remarkable development came when Jacob was 2.5 years old. He had been playing with letter blocks while Savannah worked with Lily on a particularly challenging case. Suddenly, he stood up and walked over to the desk, his small fingers moving the blocks to spell out a word. M-I-T-O. Savannah and Ethan exchanged confused glances, but when they looked at Lily, her eyes were wide with what could only be described as excitement. "Mito?" Savannah asked. "Mitochondrial?" Lily's eyes moved in what they had learned was her version of a nod. They reviewed the case again through the lens of mitochondrial disease, and suddenly, patterns that had seemed random clicked into place. The child in question had a rare mitochondrial disorder that affected multiple organ systems in unusual ways. Treatment was complex, but possible now that they knew what they were dealing with. When asked later how he knew to spell that word, Jacob just shrugged and said, "Mama showed me." But Lily hadn't moved, hadn't pointed, hadn't done anything observable. The communication, if it had happened, had occurred through channels that current science couldn't detect or explain. It was simultaneously thrilling and unsettling, raising questions about consciousness, communication, and connection that challenged fundamental assumptions about how minds worked. As the center approached its first anniversary, a decision was made to document everything that had been learned in a series of medical papers. Not sensationalized accounts that would turn Lily and Jacob into media spectacles, but serious scientific documentation of a phenomenon that could advance medical understanding. The papers would be published simultaneously in several prestigious journals, ensuring that the information would reach the medical community while maintaining the dignity and privacy of those involved. Writing these papers required careful consideration of how to present something that challenged conventional medical understanding. How do you describe a diagnostic process that relies on micro-movements interpreted through touch? How do you explain a toddler who seems to understand complex medical concepts? How do you document consciousness that persists and functions despite massive neurological trauma? The team spent months crafting language that was scientifically rigorous while acknowledging the mysteries that remained. The response from the medical community was mixed, but largely positive. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration or misinterpretation of coincidence, but many others, particularly those who had seen their patients helped by Lily's diagnoses, recognized that something genuine and important was happening. Several major medical centers requested permission to send representatives to observe the diagnostic process, leading to the establishment of a formal observation program. These observations led to unexpected developments. Dr. Robert Kim, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, noticed patterns in Lily's eye movements that corresponded to specific types of diagnostic insights. Working with technology specialists, he developed an eye tracking system that could potentially allow Lily to communicate more directly. The system was still crude, requiring intense concentration from Lily and careful calibration, but it offered the promise of expanding her ability to share her insights. Another visiting physician, Dr. Maria Santos from the Mayo Clinic, became fascinated by the role of emotional connection in the diagnostic process. She observed that Lily's accuracy increased when dealing with cases that had strong emotional components, situations where the child's suffering was particularly acute or where the family's desperation was palpable. This led to research into the role of empathy in pattern recognition, suggesting that emotional investment might actually enhance cognitive processing in ways that hadn't been previously understood. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Alan Sterling, a physicist who had heard about the case through a medical colleague, proposed the applying quantum entanglement theories to consciousness. His hypothesis, while highly speculative, suggested that consciousness might operate on quantum levels that could explain the seemingly impossible connections between Lily and Jacob, and potentially between Lily and the children she diagnosed. "We accept quantum entanglement in particles, Doctor," Sterling explained during a presentation to the team. "We know that particles can be connected in ways that transcend space and time. Why is it so hard to imagine that consciousness, which emerges from quantum processes in the brain, might have similar properties? Perhaps what we're seeing with Lily and Jacob isn't a violation of natural laws, but a demonstration of natural laws we don't yet understand." The theory was controversial to say the least, but it opened new avenues of research. Physicists and neuroscientists began collaborating in ways they never had before, using the Lily Morgan case as a starting point for exploring the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. While no definitive answers emerged, the questions being asked were pushing the boundaries of multiple scientific fields. As Jacob approached his third birthday, his abilities had become even more pronounced. He could now articulate some of his insights, though his explanations often raised more questions than they answered. When asked how he knew that a particular child's symptoms were connected, he would say things like, "The patterns talk to each other," or "Mama's thoughts have colors, and I can see which colors match." These statements were recorded and analyzed, but their meaning remained elusive, like trying to understand a new language without a dictionary. Despite his unusual abilities, or perhaps because of them, Jacob was developing into a remarkably well-adjusted child. He had friends at preschool who accepted his quirks without question. He loved stories and songs, played with toys like any other child, and showed a particular fondness for finger painting that had nothing to do with patterns or medicine. Savannah's philosophy of love first, everything else second, had created a balance that allowed Jacob to be both extraordinary and ordinary. The impact of the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center extended far beyond the individual cases it solved. It had fundamentally challenged how the medical community thought about consciousness, communication, and the nature of diagnostic thinking. Medical schools began incorporating case studies from the center into their curricula, using them to teach students about thinking beyond conventional boundaries. Research into consciousness and its relationship to medical practice received new funding and attention. But for all the scientific advancement and medical breakthroughs, the heart of the story remained deeply personal. It was about Savannah's daily devotion to her friend, arriving early every morning to help with Lily's care, staying late to ensure she was comfortable. It was about Ethan's transformation from a skeptical doctor to someone who understood that medicine was as much art and mystery as it was science. It was about the families who found hope when they had none, who saw their children saved by a woman who couldn't speak and a friend who refused to give up. One evening, as the sun set through the windows of the diagnostic center, casting long shadows across the room filled with butterflies, Ethan found himself alone with Lily, Savannah, and Jacob. The day's consultations were done, another child's life likely saved, another butterfly to be added to the wall. Jacob was drawing with crayons, creating swirls of color that probably held meaning beyond what they could understand. Savannah was gently brushing Lily's hair, humming softly, a ritual that had become part of their daily routine. "You know," Ethan said, breaking this comfortable silence, "when I first discovered what you were doing, I thought I was uncovering some kind of deception. But what I really discovered was the opposite of deception. I found the truest form of medicine I've ever witnessed. Medicine that transcends physical limitations, that operates through love and determination, that proves consciousness is far more resilient and mysterious than we ever imagined." Savannah smiled, her hand still gently moving through Lily's hair. "She always said that medicine was about seeing the whole picture, not just the parts. I think maybe now she sees a bigger picture than any of us can imagine. And through her, through Jacob, through all of this, we're getting glimpses of it too." Lily's eyes, those windows to a brilliant mind trapped in a silent body, seemed to shine with something that might have been agreement, might have been joy, or might have been something beyond what words could capture. In that moment, with the four of them together in the gentle light of evening, the mystery didn't need to be solved. It was enough that it existed, that it helped, that it proved human potential couldn't be measured by conventional means. The story that had been titled "Baby Taught Mother Bear to Read Medical Charts" had revealed itself to be something far more profound. It wasn't about teaching or reading in any conventional sense. It was about consciousness finding ways to express itself despite impossible odds. It was about love creating bridges that science couldn't yet explain. It was about a mother's gift passing to her son in ways that challenged understanding of inheritance and development. Most of all, it was about the beautiful, terrifying, wonderful truth that human beings were capable of far more than anyone had imagined. As the months turned into years, the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center became a beacon of hope for families facing medical mysteries. The butterfly wall grew until it covered not just one wall but three, each butterfly representing a child whose life had been touched by Lily's gift. Jacob grew from a mysterious toddler into a remarkable child who somehow balanced his extraordinary abilities with a surprisingly normal childhood. And through it all, Savannah continued her devoted care of Lily, their friendship transcending the boundaries of conventional communication. The medical papers published about the center sparked worldwide interest and research. Scientists from various fields converged on the questions raised by Lily's case. How did consciousness persist through such trauma? What was the nature of the connection between Lily and Jacob? How could pattern recognition operate at such an intuitive level? While definitive answers remained elusive, the search for them pushed forward understanding of neuroscience, consciousness studies, and the nature of human cognition itself. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center wasn't scientific, but human. It reminded the medical community that beyond all the technology, tests, and procedures, medicine was fundamentally about one human being helping another. It proved that love and determination could accomplish what seemed impossible. It demonstrated that every person, no matter how limited they might appear, had potential that could contribute to the world in meaningful ways. The story continues to this day, with new cases arriving weekly, new butterflies being added to the walls, and new mysteries emerging from room 318. Jacob, now 5 years old, has begun formally learning to read medical texts, his understanding far exceeding what should be possible for his age. But he also plays soccer with his friends, builds elaborate Lego constructions, and insists on bedtime stories just like any other child. The balance that Savannah fought to maintain has held, allowing him to be both gifted and normal, extraordinary and ordinary. Lily's condition has shown small improvements over the years. She can now move her fingers slightly more, allowing for clearer communication through the marking system. The eye-tracking technology has evolved to the point where she can type simple words, though the effort required means that the hand-guided marking system remains her primary means of diagnostic communication. There's hope that continued advances in brain-computer interface technology might eventually give her more freedom to express herself. But for now, the system they've developed continues to save lives. The relationship between Savannah and Lily has become legendary within the hospital, a testament to the power of friendship and loyalty. Savannah, now in her 60s, shows no signs of slowing down, arriving each morning with the same determination she showed years ago when she first refused to give up on her friend. She's trained other nurses in the interpretation technique, ensuring that Lily's gift can continue to be shared even when Savannah eventually retires, though she insists that day is still far in the future. Ethan, who has become the medical director of the center, often reflects on how this experience has changed his approach to medicine. He's learned to look beyond the obvious, to consider possibilities that seem impossible, to remember that consciousness and healing operate in ways that science is only beginning to understand. He's become known for his ability to solve difficult cases, not through any special technique, but through the openness to mystery that Lily's case taught him. The families who have been helped by the center have formed their own community, supporting each other through medical challenges and celebrating victories together. They share a bond forged by the experience of having hope restored when all seemed lost, of seeing their children saved by a method that defies conventional explanation. Many of them return regularly to visit, to add their new butterflies to the wall, and to pay respects to the remarkable woman who saved their children despite being unable to speak or move. As this phase of the story draws to a close, the impact of what happened in room 318 continues to ripple outward. Medical schools are reconsidering how they teach diagnostic thinking. Researchers are exploring new models of consciousness that could explain the phenomena observed at the center. Families facing medical mysteries have new hope that answers might be found even when traditional methods fail. But, at its heart, this remains a deeply personal story about 4 people whose lives intersected in ways that changed everything. Lily, the brilliant doctor whose mind refused to be silenced by physical trauma. Savannah, the loyal friend whose faith made the impossible possible. Jacob, the remarkable child who bridges worlds in ways that science cannot yet explain. And Ethan, the doctor who learned that the greatest mysteries in medicine aren't diseases to be cured, but potentials to be discovered. The title, Baby Taught Mother Bear to Read Medical Charts, has become both a misnomer and a perfect description. It's wrong in its specifics, but right in its essence. It captures the wonder and impossibility of what happened while missing the deeper truth. The baby didn't teach anyone to read charts. Instead, he became part of a connection that allowed his mother's brilliance to shine through impossible circumstances. The mother bear didn't learn to read medical charts. She learned to read the tiny movements of a friend's hand, to interpret the slightest resistance as complex medical insights. In the end, this story is about the mysteries that remain in medicine and human consciousness, the questions that push science forward, and the love that makes miracles possible. It's about refusing to give up on people, about seeing potential where others see only limitation, and about the connections between humans that transcend what we think we know about how the world works. As the sun sets on another day at the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center, as another child's life is saved by impossible insights, as Jacob draws patterns that hold meanings beyond his years, as Savannah gently helps her friend communicate brilliance through the tiniest movements, and as Ethan watches it all with continued wonder, the mystery continues. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of all, that in an age where science seems to have explained everything, there remain mysteries that remind us how much we still have to learn about consciousness, connection, and the unlimited potential of the human spirit. The story of the Lily Morgan Diagnostic Center isn't ending. It's evolving, continuing to challenge what we think we know, continuing to save lives through methods that shouldn't work but do, continuing to prove that love and determination can transcend any limitation. It stands as a testament to the power of refusing to accept the impossible, of believing in people when medicine says there's no hope, and of understanding that sometimes the most profound communications happen without words. The most brilliant insights come from unexpected sources, and the most powerful medicine is the connection between human souls.